Suburban Folk is now live every Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Just download the Podbean app and search for Suburban Folk or visit suburbanfolk.podbean.com for the latest topic and login information. We'll talk about what I learned from our most recent episode, give previews of episodes to come, chat with our audience, and answer any questions they may have. We're grateful for all of our listeners that tune in and are excited to share the show to a larger audience. Subscribing, rating, and reviewing us on your favorite podcast platform is a big help, and be sure to share with your friends as well. For those looking to support us even further, a donation button has been added to our website at suburbanfolk.com. All money received will be 100% redirected into advertising and getting the word out about the show. Now sit back and enjoy this episode. Health, travel, finance, parenting, and entertainment. This is the Suburban Folk Podcast.
I'm looking forward to having some real talk with some real folks.
Welcome to the Suburban Folk Podcast. This is Greg. Today, my guest is John Crepezzi. John, how you doing?
I am pretty good. Thank you.
I came across you on the Parallel Passion podcast. We actually had Miha on an episode recently. And what struck me for your guys' conversation is the focus on DIY and all of the different projects you seem to get into, up into including, if I'm not mistaken, your kids' science experiments and other projects that sounded super overblown that I might have you tell the same story that you told on that episode, among other things.
Yeah, I'm happy to. That sounds awesome.
So since I came across you on Parallel Passions, and for those that have not listened to that podcast, the idea is for people that are coders, developers in the tech world to highlight the other interests that they have. So let's real quickly start there for you. What is your day job?
So my day job, I am a staff software engineer at GitHub. I don't know how familiar people are with GitHub or how far into that I should go, but GitHub is a code hosting platform that a lot of companies use to host their code and collaborate on their code together.
Okay. Yeah, I'm familiar with it as far as being, is it an open form or open source platform?
So a big part of what GitHub does is it supports open source software, which we can also talk about that if you're interested, but open source software, and then also businesses pay GitHub to be able to host and collaborate internally on their code. So there's private code and public code.
Well, here was a question sort of putting a couple concepts together that I had around the tech piece and later on what we're going to get to for DIY. Do you feel like people that get into the IT side of any given business correlates to things like home projects, or are there any other, dare I say, stereotypes that come along with people that you tend to interact with on the technical side of things?
It's funny you should say that, because for a long time I've thought definitely the people crossing over DIY. I know for a long time there was a connection between things like, for example, math and music connect pretty well. I've also noticed, I think we're probably going to talk about rock climbing at some point in this. So I've also noticed that a lot of people that are rock climbing tend to be the puzzle sort, leaning technical, not necessarily in an IT background, but definitely in a job that requires them to like problem solve. And that connects very strongly to like what rock climbing is at its core.
Well, funny you mentioned that with problem solving and math. One of the reasons I put rock climbing on my list is because my son is 5 and, pretty young for figuring out what he wants to do activities wise, but we somewhat randomly tried rock climbing and he took to it. And he also very young was into puzzles, super into Legos. Maybe that does explain why rock climbing out of the gate was something that he was interested in, because it's that same side of the brain that people use.
Yeah, I often say in rock climbing, they call when you're climbing, they call them problems, right? So you're going up the wall, and you're solving these problems. And even they, like in their verbiage and nounage, like acknowledge that these are problems on the wall that you have to work through.
So picking one of the other items that you mentioned that go together and with problem solving puzzles was music. And I have played music since middle school and up through college. And my understanding, similar for yourself, sounds like maybe even similar types of bands that you played in, like punk rock bands. Can you talk a little bit about your drumming and what types of bands you played in?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I started when I was very young. I guess when they give you an instrument, I chose the trombone. I wanted to pick the drums, but I wasn't allowed to pick the drums because my parents didn't like the noise. So they pushed me in the direction of trombone, which like, I don't know if they understood that that's also super loud, but we did that. We did trombone. And trombone is an awesome instrument, but I really still wanted to play the drums. And then my parents were divorced. So at one Christmas, my dad decided to get me a drum set to have at his house. So we had it upstairs, and I would go to his house on the weekends and I would play this drum set. And I remember sitting down at it and like almost being afraid to hit them. Mm-hmm. Like, and then my older brothers would come in and they would just like go insane on this drum set. Like, and I was like, stop, you're ruining them. That's not what they're for. And then I remember like going to see a band play, and like they were playing like my brothers were playing. Mm-hmm. Like obviously they had skill that my brothers did not have, but it was like, oh, you're supposed to hit these things. So then I started like getting more into the drum set, and I ended up starting a punk band. I think I started the band probably when I was like, I want to say like 10 or 11. We were pretty young. We were definitely not real punk, like it wasn't until later that, we evolved in that sense. But we started playing, and we were one of the first groups in our schools to be playing music, and we would practice after school. And we were just like hang out and play. We ended up recording a small EP, and then that kind of went into the next band. The way that bands normally work, I'm sure you can relate to this, is like one band kind of leads into the next band. You find that maybe there's someone that was in a band that you played with often, and maybe like you are spending more time with them than you're spending with your own band, or maybe like you end up having a jam session on the weekends that goes pretty well, and then you end up starting something separately. Even professional big bands, you can see this. You can like draw, lines between, if you take Rancid, like came from Operation Ivy, you can draw lines all the way down, and like those lines are still going now. That's just like how bands evolve. So through many evolutions, I was probably in 10 different bands throughout the years. Everything ranging from just like playing in our spare time jam band to like recording an album. At one point we took a couch to Asbury Park Beach and put the couch in the water and had like a professional photo shoot on Asbury Park Beach. So that's like the most professional we got, if that is professional. So
as long as the pictures came out good, it sounds like it would be
they were amazing. And it's like, I would like, still I go back and look at the pictures and I'm just like, what were we doing? But they're very cool.
I was not quite as young as you were starting to play in bands, because it was maybe more of the beginning of high school. But there was definitely a sense when you rent out like the volunteer fire halls and stuff like that like who could be the heaviest, who could get more people going. Even though it was supposed to be a community, there was still a little bit of that competition, I feel like, going on, and it seeed like the heaviest band was the winner.
We entered at some point this battle. I don't know why I'm telling this story, but I guess this is how it's supposed to go. But we had this battle of the bands, and there was this guy in the battle of the bands that he was like kind of organizing the whole thing, and he was older, but he was an amazing bass player. And when we were playing, for some reason he like really took to me, and we had like a like we spent more time together, and like he kind of was a mentor as far as the bands go. And still, when I see that guy, like he plays in a band now called Shorty Long, which is a cover band that kind of goes up and down the East Coast. They're amazing band. Still, when I go to his concerts, like he'll like stop what they're doing and he'll be like, John, just like in the middle of playing a song. So just like the amount of people that you meet and the things that you can do in a band, it's just such an amazing experience to like have to be connected to these people. I don't know. I loved it.
And fast forwarding to today, are you still playing music, whether it's in an original punk band or cover band or any other form?
I haven't played probably in the past 2 years, but it's something that I think about pretty constantly. And I have thought, in my basement, I have my full drum set still set up, and it's pretty loud, obviously, because it's a drum set. And so I don't get to play it as much as I want to. And I've been thinking about getting an electric drum set. But one problem there is like, I feel like by getting the drum set, I'm admitting to myself that I'm not going to be playing out anymore, that I won't be taking my like real drum set out. So I think that's what's stopping me from like making the final jump. So it's like, in one sense, I want to do this so that I can play more, but I know that by doing that, I'm admitting to myself that like this era of my kind of musical time is over.
As a guitar player, I didn't really have those same reservations, but it makes sense for what you're saying. I have the same consideration actually for my amps, right? I still have the half stack and, a couple different heads. And I find myself looking at some of the practice amps like that would be a lot more reasonable and probably even make me pick up my guitars more because it's not such a issue getting everything out and everything set up. But like you said, then you're admitting that, oh, I'm never going to use that equipment that you need to have to go play out somewhere. So I'm right there with you.
I have in my basement also a setup for, I played guitar for a bit and I played bass for a little bit, and I have setups for both of those and some mics in the basement. And it's fun now because like sometimes friends come over and we play, and that's a good time. And I have kids, they like to come down and kind of watch us.
Remind me the age of your kids, and are any of them playing music right now?
So I have 4 kids, which is wild, but it's like wild to think that I've gotten to here. But it's they're 10, 8, 4, and 1. And the oldest one has started playing an instrument in school. They made her they pick an instrument just like I got to pick the trombone. She wanted to play an instrument, so we actually ended up having her pick the trombone. So she's playing trombone too. And so she's getting really into it. And we're noticing, you kind of notice very quickly what a child likes as far as music goes, but we're noticing that she really likes to sing. So trying to steer things in that direction, thinking about getting vocal lessons for her.
What age was she when you first started exploring the instruments?
Probably about a year ago was when we first started pushing it. She took piano lessons briefly, but they didn't work out. So I think there's nothing worse than having a kid that wants to do something like piano lessons, and then it's not something that they like, and you force them to do it. I think a lot of parents do that, and it probably drives kids away from music.
Yeah. And speaking of things that I have to force myself to do, let's get into some of the DIY projects. Like I said, this is something that I've wanted to get some episodes in on, and folks that really enjoy doing certain house projects, how you go about it, what your experience has been. I like to complete a project, and I'm the type that when I start it, I'm ready to go. In the middle of it, as issues inevitably come up, start wondering, why did I take this on? But then once it's over, I feel good about it again, and sort of gives me enough energy to go on to the next one. So I thought to maybe get a basis for us, can you tell me what type of home you currently live in, maybe even a little bit of history of maybe prior homes that you've lived in, and where you got your basis for home DIY projects?
Yeah, I'd love to. So we lived in northern New Jersey when I left college, and that's when my wife and I got together. And then we moved over to northern New Jersey, a different part of northern New Jersey, near Montclair, for those that are familiar with the area. And we bought a house there. And when we bought that house, I knew nothing about DIY anything. I knew nothing about fixing homes other than what I had learned from my grandfather growing up, which was, I guess, a fair amount, but he wasn't letting me do the projects. He was doing them and I was kind of helping. So when you're there by yourself all of a sudden and you're buying your first drill, it's a lot more intimidating than when your grandfather brings all of his tools and is ready to have you work with him. So some basics, things like you turn a screw to the right and it gets tighter, but maybe you don't know how to start if you want to replace a door. So we didn't go very far in that house because the house, even though it was built in 1920, was pretty sturdy. It's funny when you're in a house, maybe your first house, you see all of these problems that you have, and you think oh, I wish I had more space, or I wish I had, maybe within the first year, I think that we had a leak in the basement and we had to get it fixed, and it was pretty cheap to get it fixed. And it's not until after you leave a house that you typically can look back and say that house was pretty good. That house was pretty sturdy. The floors didn't creak when we walked around. And anyway, this house was built in 1920 and it was very sturdy for what it was. So then we left there and we moved to Brooklyn. And when we moved to Brooklyn, we couldn't afford to buy a place for obvious reasons because Brooklyn's expensive. So we rented in Brooklyn. And then at one point while we were in Brooklyn, our landlords decided that they were going to sell our apartment, and we had not signed a lease. So we had signed a lease, but the lease had expired, and we thought oh, this is great. We don't have a lease anymore. So we're just going month to month, and we have the power here. But actually what that meant is that when they want to sell the place, that we basically have no no say in it.
Mm-hmm.
So then we ended up looking for a house kind of on a rush. And rather than look in Brooklyn, we ended up looking in New Jersey again. We found a house in Monmouth County. It is a single family house. We have, like I said, 4 kids. So we have a 5-bedroom house. We have 1 guest room, 2 kids share a room, and then we have a master bedroom. It is on 1.2 acres of land. And I guess that's pretty much it. Yeah, it was built in 1972. I don't think I mentioned that. Oh, and it's built on a land that has, every house has septic and well. So I think a lot of people don't expect that for New Jersey, but that has been interesting.
Yeah, I might have to have you expand upon septic and well, because actually in our home search, which was about 4 years ago, the neighborhood that we really liked, most of the homes were septic and well. It just so happened, now we did not end up in this house, but the one we really liked was one of like 5 maybe in the neighborhood that was not. It was all on the city sewer. But I know there are specific considerations having to deal with that. Have you had to, just sticking with the DIY, have you had to deal with anything yourself or just having people come out?
I refused to DIY on the septic stuff. So we ended up getting a replacement septic system. When we first moved in, the house was, everything passed an inspection, but the septic system failed the septic inspection. And so we actually used that to get some like leverage to get some amount off the house, which was great. And then the septic system, instead of failing, was fine for like a couple of years. And then we had some extra money that we knew we would have to do this like pretty soon. And we didn't want, septic is the kind of thing, as you'd probably imagine, that if you like leave it being a problem, it's just going to be more of a problem. So we had it replaced recently. Obviously, if you read online about, I did read about like septic DIY to see like what that would involve. It's a lot of work. So, I mean, even seeing them come, they dug like a 15-foot deep hole, because we're on a hill. So they dug like a 15-foot deep hole and filled it with sand. It's just like probably out of the realm of at least my DIY.
So 1972, this is kind of a guess as far as what you would potentially be dealing with. I'm thinking maybe not grounded for electrical. That would be a consideration. At that point, you're into drywall. You're not having to deal with like plaster or anything like that. When you think of 70s houses, there's certain layouts that come to mind. I don't know. Well, what kind of layout are you dealing with?
So we have a center hall colonial, is what it is. And it was actually built by, his name is Zimmerer. He was like I guess a master builder in Monmouth County. People still like look for the houses made by this guy because they were apparently very well built, which I think, I don't know, I guess I haven't left the house to be able to reflect on how good the house is yet, but I do think like it's pretty well built for what it is. I think like the 70s and the 80s even more so are typically like an area where construction practices kind of like were not as great as they had been previously. So I think we got lucky to find a house that was built in that era that was built correctly.
In the floor plan, I'm imagining is probably a pretty classic floor plan. For example, what I was going to say for 70s is like split levels can come to mind, and you know that can definitely cause problems depending on what people are looking for with their floor plan. So at least you're not dealing with that out of the gate, like I don't know, moving walls or whatever you could even do there.
Yeah, it's a pretty classic floor plan. If you imagine a house, a typical house with like a typical center hall colonial with like a front door, there's essentially like 2 windows on the bottom level and then 3 across the top. It's like that, but like a little bit wider than a normal one. So inside of that, there's like a living room, dining room, den, and kitchen, all like 4 corners of the house. And then upstairs is all the bedrooms. You
mentioned, which I also totally agree, that there is a difference between having your grandfather or father or somebody walking you through a needed house improvement versus you're on your own, both tools as well as potentially knowledge. Where did you start from ground zero and then build up your knowledge? And then, yeah, like you said, we'll get into tools.
I did small things growing up. So at one point I wanted a skim board. And so I made a skim board. And it wasn't very good, but it was like something that I could look at and say, like, I made that. But the first time that I was doing something for home, I remember I wanted to build a sandbox. So I had to go build a sandbox, and I didn't have a circular saw. So I went and got a bunch of wood, and I brought the wood home. And I remember looking at the wood and just being like, well, this is not the right size. Like I got a bunch of like 2x6s, and I was like, well, this is not, you can't build the sandbox with like just this size wood. So I was like, okay, I remember like the way you have to cut a 2x6 is with a circular saw. So I went back to the store and I bought a circular saw and a drill. And I still have them, actually, those ones that I bought, because they're pretty good. Came home and you cut up the wood for the outside of the thing. And I wanted to have a cover on it as well. So I bought some plywood and was cutting that with the circular saw. But I always I said this on the other podcasts on Parallel Passions as well. But I think that the first time that you take something like a 2x6 and you cut it with a circular saw, that's like a superpower. I mean, it's a superpower even if you did it with a handsaw, your ability to take this thing that was one size and turn it into another size. And then if you like want to fasten those 4 things together, that's another superpower, is you can now drill a hole that you can put a screw in to take 2 boards and fasten them together. And that idea carries itself all the way through all of the other things that we're going to talk about here. It's just like a series of looking at something and being like, how do I do this? And then doing some research and finding out that there's some superpower that you can obtain, either a new skill set or a new tool to do the thing that you want to do. And sometimes eventually you'll realize you'll want to do a particular project and you'll look at all the superpowers in your arsenal and you'll be like, wow, I have everything I need to build this thing already. And then you just build it. And like, that is an amazing feeling. It's an amazing feeling to get to the point where you're not learning something new or buying something new to build something that you have in your mind. So I built that playpen with the top. You have to have the top to keep the cats out. And then that kind of like got me started. Then I took a break from it for a while we moved away. And it wasn't until we got this new house that things really took off, because finally I had a 2-car garage that I could start filling with things. And at the same time, my grandfather got pretty sick and was getting rid of all of the tools that he had. So we moved. I got this 2-car garage. I brought the couple tools that I had, and then I was able to bring the kind of full collection of tools that my grandfather had, where he said, my whole life, he had said like, oh, someday, like you're going to have a lot of stuff to dig through. And like, he was right. There's just so much stuff. Not even tools, but he kept like there are just like buckets of bolts, like you would see maybe at your grandfather's house, like there's just like a bucket of bolts and a bucket of washers, and like sorting through that and trying to figure out like what here is good. What do we keep? How can we organize these things so that they're able to be used? Was a process, but definitely worth it, because now I have a shop that is like ready for me to build anything that I need to build. And obviously it's expanded in a million different ways since then. So it's been about maybe 3.5 years since I started like formally building out this shop. Oh, cool. So you're using the garage like exclusively for a workplace, like I assume a bench and all of your tools. Yeah, cars don't go it's fully a workspace at this point. And that's because I'm sure we'll talk about the projects, but it's because the things that I've started building have become a lot bigger, and the DIY projects that I have are a lot bigger. I think your amount of tools and your amount of ability to process things has to grow with the size of the house, because obviously like the house is a lot larger now, so there are a lot of more things that fail. Yeah, I've definitely dealt with the same. A quick anecdote to go along with what you're mentioning for inherited tools, and if you get them from, again, grandfather, father, whoever, my father-in-law has tons and tons of tools, and he can't use at this point. And I had to replace a kitchen sink, and everything was just rusted and so on underneath the sink. And he had every wrench possible, luckily for me, because I only have maybe a couple of vice grips, a very standard wrench set, and all sort of a standard length. He happened to have these real stubby ones that would fit right up where you needed underneath the sink, and made the job way, way easier than if I just had what I had amassed up to that point. And that was actually just, I don't know, maybe a month to a month and a half ago. So it is nice when you can get some of those extra things. I'm curious though, do you have any rules of thumb for when you need to get a new tool that may be just a little better for the job that you're doing versus looking at what you already have and something that might get you by? Yeah, I do. My general rule of thumb is that if there's the right tool for the job and I don't have it, that I go pick it up, and I add it to my arsenal. And like I will use that thing in the future. Like one example recently to talk about a sink actually is behind the sink, you have up near where the faucets are, you need to be able to get the nut that like kind of retains the individual handles, if you have individual handles, on. And there's a particular tool to do that. There's a tool that is a wrench that can kind of flip to the side so that you can twist it from the bottom. And typically they can extend, and you can twist it from the bottom and not have to try to get like a wrench up in that tiny little space up near the sink. So I didn't have one of those. It is so frustrating to do it without that tool. And then you put the tool in there, it costs $20, and it is so easy to do. And you can get it tighter. Like you can, probably a lot of the reason that there was rust under your sink is because there was a minor leak going through, or someone didn't use like plumber's putty underneath the faucet handles. So like that's even more reason to make sure that you have the right tool to be able to get it down to the right torque or whatever. I've also noticed that my grandfather had a lot of his tools were or are focused toward a particular use, right? Because his tools are going to be kind of based on what he was doing. So my grandfather was a garage door repairman, which is a pretty good general use tool thing, but then was very into boats. So there are a lot of tools that he had that are for working on engines or are for like pulling spark plugs that I don't have a use for. So what I've done with those, I think a lot of people would either throw them away or more likely would put them all in their tool chest and like let them take up all the space. And that's what I did for a long time, is I just had like this really overflowing tool chest full of tools that I didn't really know what they did. And just recently I went and I took everything in my tool chest and anything that I didn't have an immediate use for, I put into a second tool chest in the basement. So there's a tool chest down there of like all the tools that I'm not using at this time, or I have some kind of like weird sentimental attachment to. And then in the garage, I have just the things that I'm ready to use. Or if I have duplicates of something, I'll also put that in the basement. So if I need something that I don't have, I just go down there and get it. And I kind of am letting the tools in the basement kind of build the tools at hand, so that the tools that I have in the garage are a reflection of what I'm actually using instead of a reflection of what he was using.
And you could almost compare it to what you hear about wardrobes, right? If you put everything to one side of the closet and then when you put on one of the outfits, then you move it over to the other side, and whatever never moved after a month maybe is something you just need to get rid of, or like you said, put it elsewhere so that it's not cluttering up the stuff that you are using on a regular basis.
But to think that like every tool that you had was like that he had everything, or that every tool that he had was the perfect version. Like I could force myself to use, for example, like his hammer, but probably a modern hammer is going to give me like better impact and is probably worth having, like a fiberglass handled hammer. So I keep the tools when they make sense, but then if there's like a better modern equivalent, I will get that. And it's also like a lot of people say like my grandfather didn't have a lot of tools, or he didn't have a lot to give me, or I didn't get the thing. A lot of times what I'm also doing is I'm going to things like garage sales and trying to like buy out boxes of tools and sorting through them to figure out what is right and wrong. Sometimes those things are rusted. So then sometimes you get to do a little bit of like a rescue on the tool, which typically just involves putting it into like a bath of a solution like Evapo-Rust to get it clean, and then cleaning it up a little bit. But there's a lot of tools out there that you can get for really cheap.
That is an interesting point. I don't know that I've ever looked for tools at a garage sale, but it would make sense. Do you typically get like hand tools, or have you even picked up like electric, like saws or some things like that?
I mostly go for hand tools at garage sales. I guess a lot of the saws and things that you'll find have either been like badly mistreated or were the budget version of what they were. And I think on electrical tools in particular, safety has come a long way recently. And also unless you know a lot about how these electrical tools are put together. For example, I bought a table saw when I was first getting started. I went and purchased a table saw on Craigslist. Now I could have just started using it. I think actually the first day I did cut a little bit of stuff on it. But it became apparent pretty quickly that like the table saw had been kind of like cobbled back together by a couple different previous owners. That's fine if you know them and you can trust that the table saw was safe. But it's also scary to imagine that like there might be a bolt that's supposed to be holding on the arbor that's not like fully tightened down. Like that could become a really dangerous situation. So what I ended up doing was taking the table saw fully apart into its pieces, cleaning all the different pieces, and then reassembling it using a copy of the manual from when the saw was first made. So I knew that the saw was put back together exactly how it was supposed to, meaning like every bolt had its like lock washers on, and make sure that it's not going to just like throw a saw blade at me, which I definitely don't need.
Yeah.
I don't need a saw blade in the face. So I think like electrical tools are a little bit scarier because like there's a power there that is not just your own hand. So you just really have to be careful when you're taking an electrical tool.
Going back to what you mentioned of the superpower, and that is correct. You've, by extension, making yourself able to do things that, of course, you couldn't do on your own. Even with a circular saw, I can definitely get butterflies, when I'm getting ready to make that cut. For all the reasons you mentioned, that is a really good point, that it's even a heightened level of being cautious if somebody has done something to the tool that you don't know about. But even the regular tools themselves, like you mentioned, maybe budget versions of some of these tools may have plastic pieces that could fail or things like that. Emphasis on safety, certainly, when using saws, drills, all of that kind of stuff.
My grandfather's collection of tools, one of the kind of few electric tools that existed in it was he had a handheld router. Yeah. So a router is, think of it like a drill, but a drill that spins more faster than a normal drill. And on the end of the drill, there's a bit that has a certain profile on it. So instead of just being like an up and down, like drill bit, it is maybe a round over, or like you would see on the edge of a tabletop, or a chamfer, which is like a 45-degree, like a bevel that you would put against a piece. And what you do is you bring it up against the edge of a piece and you move the router, and it spins super fast and it cuts that profile into the edge of the wood that you're working with. So he had a router, and this router was an old Craftsman router, and perfectly fine router, but it had a problem where the engine would get hot, and then when the motor got hot, it would loosen its grip on the bit. So the bit would start sliding down. And what's annoying about that, to like intro learning what a router is, John, is that you're cutting something into a piece of wood, and then you step back from it and you realize that the cut that it's making is vertically going down as you move through the piece. So that's my immediate reaction, is just like, I want to throw this tool in the garbage, like, because it's not doing the one thing that it's designed to do. But then years later, John, looking back at that, is like, wow, that was probably really dangerous, because if the bit fell far enough, it was going to fly out of the tool at 15,000 RPM, which is not great. It's like, so you don't want to put yourself in a situation where kind of your lack of knowledge about a tool causes it to be dangerous. So definitely just like, research things a little bit beforehand. And I would say if you're looking at an electrical tool, have someone that knows what they're doing with that tool. If it's a new tool to you, take a look at it before you start using it.
And you mentioned whether or not folks know what a router is, maybe even stepping back even further from that. You said your first couple of purchases were a circular saw and a drill, which I would certainly agree are essential to any starting toolkit. If you were in front of somebody that didn't have anything, was starting from scratch, what would be the first 5 or 6, let's say, things you'd say you have to have these?
Yeah, I think someone just starting probably would benefit by having a jigsaw as well. So a jigsaw, I guess for those of you that don't know, a jigsaw is a blade that comes off of a tool that is, you hold in your hand, that the blade goes up and down kind of like rapidly, and you can cut. What the benefit of it is that you can cut odd shapes into a piece of wood. So if you need to cut something like a curve, you can cut that with a jigsaw. You can't cut a curve easily with a circular saw because of the kind of the length of the blade. So as soon as you start to turn, what's going to happen, and you think about this a lot in woodworking, is that the back of the blade will make contact and bind with a piece of wood, which could result in a kickback situation that could be pretty dangerous to the person holding the saw. So a jigsaw does not have that problem because the blade goes up and down instead of rotating, and because the blade is tiny instead of 6 inches wide into the wood. So a jigsaw, a drill. I would say definitely get some clamps, and probably like a good maybe rafter square or similar. A lot of the circular saw, like a lot of tools, becomes a lot more useful once you pair it with tools like a square. A circular saw by its own is kind of trusting the user to be able to like guide it straight. But things like a square you can hold with one hand and then run the circular saw next to them, allow you to create a perfect 90-degree cut to like the reference circle just by running the circular saw along the square. Similar with clamps, like if you want to cut like a long strip out of a piece of wood, you can clamp something like a 2x4 to the piece that you want to cut and then run your circular saw against that. That's how you get straight cuts with the circular saw. A lot of people think like you just have to be good with it. But kind of the more you get into woodworking and DIY, you realize that a lot of being good with tools is actually just having proper setup, not necessarily like being good at using them.
Do you have a certain size square that you would recommend for the first one somebody gets?
Yeah, I think a 6-inch square is pretty typical. You can go a little bit bigger. A 6 or 9-inch square are pretty good for home use.
Going back to the quality of a particular tool, we don't necessarily have to name brands. You can if you want to, but do you go with maybe not quite the most expensive thing in a particular category, but certainly don't get, the lowest end, or do you try to go for the most expensive or quality thing you can buy?
For a while, I was on the, I guess not lower end, but the middle end. So am I allowed to name a brand?
Sure.
So for a while I was into rigid tools because they're a pretty good kind of middle ground tool. I've recently been replacing my tools with higher end versions of the originals. A lot of times that is not because I want a better tool, but because I want a battery powered version of the thing that I have. Especially with DIY projects, I find that battery powered tools are really helpful to not have to like carry cords everywhere. I recently got another example is like a nail gun, for example, is really annoying because a nail gun has to be hooked up typically to a pneumatic source. So you have to have something like an air compressor hooked up to it. So that means anywhere you want to use a nail gun, if you want to use it on like trim upstairs, you have to bring an air compressor with you. And you can get one of those squat air compressors, but I don't have one of those. I have a taller air compressor. Right. So I was always trying to like lug this thing up the stairs. And recently I got a battery powered nail gun, and it's just amazing to be able to like take this nail gun. Anyway, the reason that I ended up with the nice tools is because I don't want to have more than one battery platform. Ideally, I don't want to have like 10 different batteries and I have to figure out which one's the right thing for a tool.
Right.
So I ended up picking one brand and I'm just buying all of them.
Similar for me, not necessarily as much with those kinds of tools, but with the outdoor tools, I did the same thing. Picked a brand that would have the same batteries, and even for like weed whacking, when I don't need the full-on gas trimmer, I can get away with a battery power one for just regular cleanup and the blower that goes with it.
I guess in addition to that, I also have some like very large tools, and those large tools I tend to buy. I tend to wait a very long time and then buy a very nice version of the tool, because I've reached like a point where I know that this is my future. Like this is a big part of what I'm going to be doing over the next 10 or 15 years. And it's just like, it's worth investing in quality. The difference between my original table saw and the table saw I have now is it's just infinitely better in every possible way. It's amazing.
Are you doing projects for other people, or do you mean just for your own use?
So I do some projects for other people, and I'm doing some projects for inside my house, and I do projects for just like weird things that I'm interested in. And I'm working on my 2020 resolutions now. So this probably will be out in 2020.
Right.
But I'm going to be trying to get some of the work that I'm doing now into like a small museum exhibit in 2020. So kind of starting to build out a portfolio that would head me in that direction. My dream is, there are companies that make interactive displays for, let's say you go to a trade show or something and there's like an interactive display to like describe a certain concept, or maybe there's like a thing that kids play with that teaches them a certain idea. I want to build a side business in making things like that. I think people typically call it experientials, but it's basically the idea of someone coming to me and saying like, this is the idea we're trying to get across. Please build us something that illustrates that idea. And I want to just have the kind of freedom to make it. That's where I want to get to. So I'm kind of plotting my course and we're going to get there.
That's really cool. I would have no idea where to start with something like that. But
if I could look at me a couple of years ago saying this thing now, I would say that I was crazy. Like it happened the way it happened was those superpowers kind of kept evolving. Like I kept having one thing and then saying like, oh man, like now I can cut iron pipe, but I wish I could thread the end of it. And like, then you end up like buying a pipe threader, and like you end up doing all these things to be able to make the next piece of what you want. And then eventually you get to something like these coasters that I made the other day, where we had this idea for a coaster, and we were able to produce fully the coaster like in one day with only things that I had laying around the shop, which is amazing. And I know coasters are pretty simple, but these coasters are great.
maybe you'll have to send me a picture of it, and when we post our episode, we can put it on Instagram.
Yeah, I could do that.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking through where I would be starting now, and I would be completely lost. I guess like anything, like you said, you sort of build on what your experience is and get a little bit further and get a little bit further. And I'm assuming things like YouTube and obviously I'm sure different blogs and so on. Where do you get most of your information for new projects that you haven't really tackled a particular piece yet?
A lot of my projects these days are inspired by projects that I did previously. I'll have one project that uses a certain component, and then that tends to give me an idea for the next thing I want to do. And so I know at least one piece of it. And then I spend the rest of the time kind of looking at it and saying like, well, I need to like move water through this thing quickly. So I need to figure out how pumps work. And then I need to take that pump and I need to be able to hook it up to the Raspberry Pi, and like pretty much everything about how the Raspberry Pi and the pump interconnect is like fairly straightforward and laid out in like the diagramming that comes with the pump. So like that's pretty easy. And it's really just like the important part for doing stuff like this is to be able to break down, and this is important in life, is being able to break down a problem into like a subset of smaller problems. So you look at something that seems really complicated, and instead of looking at the whole thing, just say like, okay, well, I need to build this tube that gets hit by this hammer. So like, what will do it correctly? Like what will that look like? So, and then just figure out one piece of the project, the problem, and work on just that.
And then maybe stepping back again, because the things you're working on are, I would say, pretty advanced and, really remarkable. If somebody is starting out, what type of projects would you say start with this? So let's say electrical, for example. We talked a little bit about plumbing as far as the sink, or you mentioned trim work for baseboards or something like that. What would be your advice for somebody just getting into a home project?
Yeah, on a home project, I think like there's got to be something in your house that annoys you, something that you kind of constantly look at. Maybe it's trim that doesn't quite meet the wall, or maybe it's the caulking in your shower is not quite holding together the way that you want it to. Go find that thing and find just that one thing, not some large project to like redo a bathroom. Don't start with that. Start with just the one thing and do it yourself. And if you do that one thing yourself, you're going to start building up this arsenal of tools, and you're going to start building up this arsenal of knowledge. And also, I guarantee, even if you don't think you did it well, that you probably did it well. I just guaranteed, so I have to, that you will do it better than a contractor that you would hire to do it, because you're going to hire a contractor, and that contractor is not going to care the way that you do. Also, you're going to be kind of overly cautious about how your work goes. So you're going to be constantly looking at your work and saying doesn't look that great. It's not perfect. There's like, this line is not perfect. Just go to somewhere else in your house where a contractor did some work, look at what they did, and find the flaws in their work too. Try to put yourself in the mindset of everyone's work having flaws and not just your own. Because I know a lot of times I get in my own mind and I'm like, oh, it's not perfect. I need to get a contractor in here that knows how to do this. But then if I look around at what a contractor did, like, they don't care. They just want to get out of there. Contractors don't typically make more money by doing a better job. Doing a better job is like kind of that's an advanced move for a contractor, because you have to be thinking far enough ahead that you're thinking, by doing a good job, I'm going to get myself more business. But that's not how contractors make more money. The way they make more money is by having faster deal flow. So you will make more money quicker as a contractor having 10 jobs than doing 8 jobs well. Meaning like, a job might give you an extra $100 for spending more time. In that time, you could have just had another job. You would have made more money. So a lot of contractors are in that mindset.
That's great advice. I also would second that. I think I came to that conclusion with landscaping, because you're not typically dealing with anything that has to be too precise. Like, for example, even just something as simple as grass cutting. There's a lot of folks that live near us that hire a service, and I say, I know I'm going to do this better, and I'm not going to go behind somebody and grumble that I paid for something that I could have done better myself anyway. And yeah, taking that same concept, like you're saying, to the home projects, and maybe even marrying that together with some of the other things we're talking about with the tools, even though there are costs associated when you first start doing those projects, getting the tools that they may not be much cheaper than a contractor. Once you have those tools and you don't have to keep ramping up to get them, you're going to save even more money than hiring the contractor.
Yeah, the cost savings are amazing. I mean, now it's at the point where it's like, some contractor gives me a price on maybe doing trim work in my house. It's like, for the price that they want to charge me for that trim, if I'm not factoring in my own hourly time, which I don't on DIY projects, then like I could mess this up like 8 times, and it would still be cheaper. So get that mindset. And I promise you, the first time you do a DIY project, someone's going to come over your house. They're going to look at it and they're going to say like, oh, that looks great. The contractor did such a good job there. And then you're going to be like, you know what? I did that. And then they're going to freak out and everyone's going to think that you're, like that you're so handy. And like, it doesn't really even take that much. And it's like, yeah, you might mess up. That's a learning opportunity. And then you can do it again because the contractor is obviously charging for their time. That's the edge you have. Like it'll always be cheaper for you to do it. And it's just a matter of, like you said, getting past the hurdle of buying the tools that you might need to do it.
I also think that if you do run into a project that you just are not comfortable with and you do need to bring in a contractor, going through the process of any DIY project helps you talk through what the contractor says they're going to be doing. And I hate to say this, but calling them out if something just sounds like they are either A, glossing over it because they don't want to give you the details for whatever reason, or B, or even making something more complicated than it really is. One that comes to mind for me is we have an irrigation system, and they said that the one I had was about to stop working, like the main controller. And I don't know, they had one for like $250. You go to Home Depot and the thing's like $50. And all you have to do is look at the way the last one was wired, take it off the wall, put the new one in, test it out, and you're good to go. So yeah, I think it helps be able to call out a contractor that's almost intentionally trying to speak over your head just so you're further convincing yourself that you can't take it on yourself.
I mean, I probably do some DIY that I shouldn't do. Like, I think a lot of people would say you shouldn't do like electric, you shouldn't do gas. I do all those things. Sometimes I like file permits for the work that I'm doing even pretty often. I even if you're doing DIY work, you can often file permits with the town. They'll come out. It's good to have a second set of eyes on the work that you do, especially if you're doing something like gas or water or electric. And that doesn't mean you can't do it. A permit is not like a reason to not do it. It's just, I don't know, a benefit of doing it because like someone can come. Like I had someone come and they said like, what electrician did this work? And I'm like, me. And the guy's like, oh, you did a pretty good job. It's like, like having someone come by and be a double check is nice. And don't start with gas, don't start with electric, but don't limit yourself either. Like you can get pretty far. Like you said, like you might end up buying a tool to double check your work. Like for example, when I do gas work, a normal gas plumber is not going to use a sniffer to be able to figure out whether there's a gas leak. They're going to trust that they know how to do it. However, I'm not a plumber. So when I do it, I want to be safe. So I turn off the main, I turn it back on, I use the sniffer, I get super paranoid, I have the inspector come by to make sure everything's okay. So just kind of know your limits, know what you have to do, and honestly just have a good time. Like we're at the point now where with this stuff where there's some stuff that I don't want to do in my house that I'll have a contractor come by. And I've at some points been like, hey, when you get to that part, can I join you on the work? Can I like come work with you on this? That's another option. We had a contractor a while ago who came and did some work at our house. And as he was leaving, I was like, hey, do you have any interest in having me come by and go on a couple of jobs with you. And they were like, yeah, that sounds great. So actually I worked with this contractor for a while, and went on jobs with him. I did flooring jobs and siding jobs. If you have an opportunity like that, or a contractor that is looking for help, that's always a good way to learn things too. And on someone else's time, you can get some extra money.
I hadn't even really considered doing that ad hoc. It makes sense if you can shadow somebody that way, and if they'll pay you, all the better.
Yeah, I was talking to him and he was like, well, just meet me tomorrow morning at this deli, and then we'll get breakfast and then we'll go out. So I met him at like 7 a.m. the next morning. I think the first job I went on was a flooring job. We went into a house, tore out a floor, put it back in. And it's amazing because this is another pro for not working with a contractor, but like, you are looking at the job, seeing all of the problems with how you did it. When you show the homeowner, or you show, even if you do DIY work at your own house, no one's going to see all those problems. Like, you're going to see the part of the trim where it doesn't quite hit the mall. No one sees that. Or you're going to see, that the paint has a little bit of like brush stroke in it. When's the last time that you walked into someone's house and saw those problems? So a lot of times you glance right past them. It's like, if a wall is painted, you go, oh, it's done. So don't be too hard on yourself is another tip.
We are all our own worst critic. It's true.
Yes. And then I've recently been giving a little bit of my DIY work away to contractors so that I can focus more on this kind of like general making thing that I've got going on that has been really, really fun. So I'm going to describe the recent thing that happened. So my daughter has this, had an expert fair at school. And an expert fair is it's like a science fair, but you pick a topic. So my first oldest daughter had chosen gymnastics as her topic. So she had this trifold board, and there was this is what gymnastics is, and this is the different moves you can do in gymnastics. So we traveled to Italy the next year, and my daughter is 1 year behind that daughter, my second daughter. So we traveled to Italy, and we were in the part of Italy where the Leaning Tower of Pisa is. So we stopped by Pisa for a day, or an hour, which is all you need, I think, in Pisa. So we saw the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and my daughter gets back. It's time for her expert fair, and she chooses to do this Leaning Tower of Pisa for her expert fair project. She goes to school, says she wants to do the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and she comes home crying. And the reason she's crying is because the kids at school were making fun of her and calling it the Leaning Tower of Pizza. I don't know if that's making fun of her, but she took it as an insult. So she was super upset that they were calling it the Leaning Tower of Pizza. So she was like, can we build a Leaning Tower of Pisa? Can we make the project more impressive so that they, I can tell them that it's cool or whatever. So I was like, yeah, we'll build a Leaning Tower of Pisa. We'll work on that together. And then she came home and she was like, I told them that we're going to build the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and the Leaning Tower of Pisa is going to be as tall as you. But I wanted to help her, and also it sounded fun. So I ended up building this Leaning Tower of Pisa. The Leaning Tower of Pisa is an 8.5 foot tall, and I'm not 8.5 foot tall, but the Leaning Tower of Pisa is 8.5 foot tall. Just to kind of add a little bit of flair, and we can link pictures to this too, but just to add a little bit of flair, when you hit a button at the bottom of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, it leans over. So it leans to 4.5 degrees, and it's like an electronic lean. There's a linear actuator underneath the tower that is 190-pound linear actuator that lifts the tower into position. So everyone's like, why isn't it leaning? And then you hit the button and it plays a song and it leans. So we built that a little bit together, but honestly, I did a lot of the work because obviously it's 8.5 foot tall tower. So we built that together. She kind of saw the process of how it was built, which I think is super important for kids to even if they're not being involved in making the thing, to be into how it got made, to see what it takes to build something like that. And to see, most importantly, we were talking before, that it's just a collection of pieces, the Leaning Tower of Pisa. When you look at it, it looks like it's finished, just like the wall, the perfectly painted wall or whatever. Really all it is to the maker is a collection of pieces. I know that people see a leaning tower, they don't see that there's a linear actuator underneath. Obviously, as the person who made it, the magic's a little bit ruined because I know what's going on. But being able to break problems like that down is super important.
How heavy is the piece?
It's probably about 150, I would guess. That includes the base and the actuator itself. The actuator is pretty light, but the base is pretty heavy. But it's funny, we brought it there. All the parents are like, what are you doing? Like, why do you have this thing here? And they're like, but then like 5 minutes later, after they're all like, why do you have this thing? They're all taking pictures with it. Like no other booths had a crowd like we had. I mean, every kid wanted to hit the button. And obviously I'm a software engineer, so I built in debouncing to the button, which is a software term for when you, I guess when you hit something a bunch of times, making it so that it does you don't want the tower to like try to flip back and forth and back and forth. You want it to just go once. So we have software that does that.
Did you have to bring it in a couple of different pieces and then put it together, I hope?
It's to scale. So I think that works out to something like 3 feet wide. So we had to go through like a back access door, and it had to come in on a dolly in 3 separate pieces that we put together.
I'm sure this goes without saying, but you mentioned 4 degrees. Is that the exact spec on the Leaning Tower Pisa?
It's not exactly 4 degrees, but the one that we did matches exactly to the real tower.
Mm-hmm. What did you do with it after the project was over?
That's a great question. So we took the base off of it. We permanently leaned it, and then we put little nets and have the cats can climb up in it. So now it's like a cat house.
Actually, that's a great way to repurpose it. Little piece of art, plus the cats have a place to hang out. That seems like a 2 for 1.
For a while, the library in town was trying to. They wanted to have it like as a piece, but we never ended up working out the details. But they wanted to have it like in the lobby, which maybe that'll happen. Maybe we'll end up putting it back together.
Also, when you mentioned having your kids watch the process, even if they can't complete it, a little bit similar vein, something I have earmarked for myself, maybe the next 5 to 10 years. I'm not super interested in real estate property from the investment standpoint of it, but I really keep considering getting one just as something to walk my kids through, just even some of the investing piece of it and, sort of a version of owning a business, but B, depending on what would come up for things breaking and so on, having them walk through those processes of potentially helping get them corrected and fixed and so on, because it certainly is a life skill that, as we're talking about, they would need, whether it's when they become a homeowner themselves or just being self-sufficient. And again, going back to the problem solving like you're talking about.
I think that's a great idea. And I think also, I think you alluded to, showing them the investment piece and that you can make something like that. This isn't something reserved for just the people, at the top or whatever, like that you can do this thing together and like produce value, like that anyone can go do this thing. I think is an important lesson for kids, because I think a lot of times, even with tools, people might look at tools and be like, that's something super interesting to me, but that's reserved only for people that do tools or whatever, like showing them that a house is just like anything else. I think even I fall into this trap sometimes of thinking that I can't do something because I'm not like an expert, but showing them that like everyone starts somewhere and that this is how you learn to do things. Also, like getting some practice in, I think is great. So I have this truck that I started building, right? And people or restoring, and people come in and they're like, "Oh, like where did you learn about trucks?" And I'm like, I didn't, like this is it right now. We're doing it. Like, I didn't know what all the parts of a front suspension were, and now I do, because like I took it apart and now we're putting it back together. So you have to figure things out as you go. There's a lot of like knowledge to be had. It's really just like picking the direction you want to go and not bucketing yourself.
What you were talking about with the tools at a garage sale, I think that mindset sticks with me for anything car related that stops me from getting too far with it. That, like you said, a saw that, can be very dangerous if it's not well maintained. That's where my mind goes for a car. But then I take it, unfortunately, in the other direction, that like, I don't want to be the one responsible for this thing hurling me down the road 60 miles an hour. And if I missed a piece or missed something else, so that's where I do definitely get nervous with some of that. But at the same time, really the same rules apply that you're saying for a contractor. Like, there are mechanics. They learned it just like you would learn it. There is plenty of material out there to figure it out, get the right tools, be thorough, et cetera, and probably you could have the same argument again that you had for the tool and, making sure all the pieces are there and rebuilding. There's a good chance you'll be more meticulous about the final result because you're the one riding in the car. You're the one that is going to be the most concerned about the safety for yourself and certainly for your family. So maybe I need to.
It's pretty amazing taking the car apart and just being like, it definitely was not together correctly before I took it apart. Like you're like looking at the manual and you're like, wait a second, there's supposed to be a bolt here and there isn't. Like I think you'd be amazed that. Not to say, mechanics do an amazing job and like they are able to work on a wide variety of vehicles very efficiently, but things get missed, like especially when they don't maybe care as much as you would. The amount of fail safes that exist in a car, especially a car of that age, I'm not saying you can't hurt yourself, but there is a good chance that by the time that you are back on the road in a fashion that could hurt yourself, that you've learned enough by doing that process that it's probably fairly safe. Also, like cars, when you're working on a car, one of the first things you learn is that bolts on a car have torque specifications, which is like how tight the bolt is supposed to be. Also, like if there are very important bolts, there are typically multiple of them in such a way that they can fail to each other. Certain situations where something could go super, super bad, like the bolt that holds the wheel on, they're called castle bolts. So they're bolts that have a thing called a cotter pin stuck through them so that they can't undo themselves. So I like there are fail safes. It's not just like you miss one bolt and you die.
Yeah.
And that's like, I think through these, I have this crazy theory on life, but I don't know if I should go into my crazy theory, but I think that there's this thing where first you look at the car and all you can see is a car. So then you're like, well, this is a whole car, and now I'm going to get in it, and I'm going to push the pedal, and it's going to go somewhere. And when it breaks, you're not thinking like, oh, this part of the car broke, or this is what the problem is. You're just thinking like, oh, the car broke. Like something, like let me bring it to a mechanic. And then you start taking a car apart, and you start working on a car. And all of a sudden, your mind flips in the other direction. And you're like, wait a second, this isn't a car. This is just like some bolts. Like I'm driving bolts. And like at any point, anything could go wrong. And then through the process of putting it back together, it doesn't quite ever get back to being a car because you can't unsee the parts, but it does stop being a collection of bolts and it becomes a system. I don't know. Does that make any sense?
It does. I think it's the overarching theme that we have for problem solving and, like you said, breaking it down. Almost the opposite of what you're talking about with the Leaning Tower of Pisa project, where you couldn't get past seeing all the parts because you put it together. It's almost the opposite effect when you aren't the one that put it together, that you just see the big final thing because at first experience of it, you don't know what went into it. But then as you are able to get further and further into it, it breaks down. I mean,
like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, like I can't unknow that there's a linear actuator underneath, but when it was finished, could step back from it and be like, oh, of course, that's the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Like, it's just, like you kind of forget, you put paint on things and you forget that like the pieces are what make it up.
I can definitely relate to that.
It's funny when you start making things, you start DIYing or you start like making, objects, how much like I was saying before that people come into your house typically won't notice like mistakes. But the more you do DIY, the more you will be able to recognize them. And it's not because you're looking at the thing and able to just spot them like your eye is different. It's more that you know where the seams are, if that makes sense. Like where to look for how things are put together. So like now I'm at when I go to a restaurant and there's like a nice looking table, I'm not at the point anymore where I can look at the table and say like, that's a nice table. I'm always at the point where I'm like looking underneath it to be like, okay, how is this put together? How is it going to be sturdy? You can have a different appreciation, but the magic, it's almost like the magic is ruined, but through the magic, you see the work, and the work is almost even more important.
I think that is a fair assessment. And I would say similar lucky for us, the house we moved into now just had better workmanship in general. So I can appreciate some of those things. Again, even like the moldings, like we've hit a couple times, are certainly easier even when you have to go fix something, because it's more predictable what you're going to find, which also makes it a little bit easier. Well, maybe moving on to, just so we hit all the things I talked about in our intro, some quick hits for rock climbing. Actually, before we go to there, I think there are plenty of more things you and I could talk about. So officially open invite if you ever are able to come back on, and we can continue to hit some of the DIY, again, whether it's home things that I focused on, or I would definitely be interested to hear how your projects are shaping up. But just to hit, like I said, we said the rock climbing. So what was your background in getting into that? And then, like I mentioned, I'm curious of your perspective on getting kids into rock climbing, since it seems like my oldest has some interest.
Okay, so the rock climbing, my background in it is right after college. I went a few times, and then we started going, my wife and I, pretty regularly before we had kids. And then when we had our first, when she was about 3 years old, and at this point I was still going, like in the mornings I was going climbing. I had like a group of friends that I would climb with. But when she was about 3 years old, we started her, which is super, super young. Like, I think that's probably like the minimum age at the gym that we were at the time. That was the earliest that you could go. So I think probably 3 years old, like you have to be able-bodied 3-year-old. I know that like my kids are all kind of different levels of like physically aware at different ages. But that's like kind of the earliest you can start. Most gyms, like the gym that I go to now, doesn't start kids until they're 5 years old. These are indoor bouldering gyms. And then we also climb outdoors sometimes. So we'll go somewhere. For us, the closest place is the Gunks, which is in New York. So we will go there, and obviously they can climb at any age then. So we had on a recent trip, or maybe a couple of years ago, we had our son, who I guess would have been like 1.5 or 2, on a top rope. Obviously, he's not like going to the top. And if he gets scared, you want to take him down immediately, and you want to be super duper safe, and you want to have a helmet on him. But I think climbing is just such a good, there are so many sports that you can do. You can kind of like hand someone a victory for, or you can say like, you were part of a team and your team did this thing, or here, like, I'm going to tell you that you're good at this, but kind of like let you learn by telling you that you're doing well. Rock climbing for me is the kind of thing where like you will do it. Kids at all different ages can do it. Adults can do it at all different ages. And when you do it, you are the reason that you got to the top of the wall. Like you climbed this thing, and that sense of accomplishment for me is addictive. And I think like for kids is such a great feeling to have, that they can climb to the wall and know that the only thing that got them up there was their arms and legs. Also for kids, like, I mean, the kids of mine that have been really into climbing spent a lot of time like climbing on chairs in super dangerous ways.
That resonates with me as well. And that's a good point about whether or not they succeeded or not in the activity, because even with your standard team sports, soccer, baseball, basketball, you could argue that even if their team doesn't win, they could, blame a teammate potentially, or even blame a referee to say, oh, well, it's that person's fault because I didn't do whatever thing. And then obviously other individual sports come to mind where you have judges, whether it's dancing or skating or things like that. But yeah, to your point with rock climbing,
there's not someone like telling you that you didn't do well, or someone that is like, it's hard to even compare yourself for someone else in rock climbing, because like obviously you can see if they climbed and you didn't, but you can't compare your feeling of what your body's doing to what they're doing. So in that way, rock climbing is also very progressive, meaning like that it can get as hard as you want it to be able to get. So I think for kids, that's also super important, that there's not tiers that you have to meet in order to play this game well. You don't have to like be able to jump up to the next tier. You don't have to be able to go, to the next level or beat this like other team that might be like some unknown level of good, or like there's not luck involved. Like it's like slow preparation and kind of get as much out of it as you want.
Well, it's an interesting one for me because I've gone rock climbing maybe 3-4 times at some local places while I was growing up, and I always had a really good time. Just wasn't something that my family as a whole was into. And I didn't really know, I guess, where to get started, or even that it was a thing to go on a consistent basis or even have competitions, which I've just recently learned part of what you can do with rock climbing. The way we even tried it for my son is it was a Groupon for a local place. And, I think it was like 3 or 4 climbs, something like that, for a discounted rate. And he really took to it. And I'm like, I've always had a good experience with it before. Obviously, again, he's young enough that we've got plenty of time for him to figure out what he's into. But it's interesting that he's taken to it a little bit more than at least the concept of some of the other team sports. So it's definitely something that I'm interested in exploring, and, is an option that I hadn't really considered before. Like you say, not necessarily a knock on other activities that are out there, but I think it's worth acknowledging for somebody like myself that didn't really think of it as an option, that, hey, it is an option of a particular activity that your kids can get into.
Yeah, and one that you can spend the day outside with your family. You can go hike, you can take some lunch. I think it's just all around is perfect.
And for kids my age, the local place here has a sign that says, "We make kids tired." So
definitely true.
So, like, for example, baseball was what I always grew up with. And I'm like, well, yeah, it'd be fun to share baseball with my kids, but they're not burning off a lot of their energy sitting in the outfield waiting for one of the other kids to hit the ball. It's like, let's get them into something.
I used to play baseball and stand the opposite way and play with butterflies. Definitely not.
Yeah, I feel like it's sort of stands alone as a particular sport. Either you love it or you hate it. And you definitely can tell. Back to, like we said with music, you can tell the kids that that's what their families just do. And so they got signed up versus the ones that maybe chose to do it themselves. Well, I do want to go ahead and wrap us up. Like I said, there are a lot of things that you brought up that I would love to have some follow-up conversations on. So we can chat offline and see if we can maybe even schedule another episode to go through some more, suburban life things and the DIY projects for sure. But
I'd love to spend some more time about making. I could talk about travel for a bit too. That'd be really fun.
That'd be perfect. Before we go, do you want to go ahead and give contact info or any projects that make sense for you to point people in your direction?
Pretty much everything is, you can follow me on Twitter or Instagram. I'm at SeeJohnRun, SeeJohnRun.
Perfect. Well, John, again, I really appreciate it. I had a lot of fun. Hopefully you did.
I did.
And we will be in touch.
Okay. Talk soon.
For definitions and explanations of some of the tools discussed in this episode, go to suburbanfolk.com for examples and recommendations of tools that you can purchase. Suburban Folk is part of the Pod All the Time podcasting network.
Hi there, it's Mo.
And Chip.
And we're the hosts of the Deep Dark Truth podcast,
an allegedly hilarious podcast that dives into your favorite conspiracies, mysteries, and bizarre true crimes.
We investigate cases like proven conspiracies, rituals, and the cryptid dating scene.
Because local cryptids want to meet you.
Listeners can also submit their own experiences and might find themselves featured on future episodes.
Subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts.
And don't forget to rate and review the podcast you're listening to right now.
And keep searching for the deep, dark truth.
I hate when you do that.
If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to give us a rating on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get podcasts. If you'd like to be notified of future weekly shows, please hit the subscribe button. Thank you.